At 2:38 a.m. on January 17, 1991, a single F-117 Nighthawk sat motionless inside a dimly lit hangar at King Khalid Air Base, Saudi Arabia. A cold spotlight from the rafters cut through the darkness and washed across its faceted skin, turning the jet into a black, angular silhouette more like a shadow carved out of metal than an aircraft preparing for war. Outside, the wind pushed sand across the concrete, but inside the hangar everything was silent. No engines, no radios, just the faint echo of boots and the metallic tick of the jet's panels cooling in the night air. Technical Sergeant Martin Reeves crouched beneath the left wing, running a gloved hand along the ram-coated edge. He wasn't checking for dents, he was checking for reflections. Any surface that bounced light had a chance of bouncing radar. And tonight, that was unacceptable. Reeves whispered to the crew chief, "Coating's clean, 0 hotspots." The chief gave a small nod. No shouting, no rushing. The pre-flight of an F-117 was a ritual done in near silence, as if noise itself might reveal something the world wasn't supposed to know. Far above them in the gloom of the hangar, the pilot descended the ladder. Major Daniel Crowley, 32 years old, 12 years flying, 0 radar locks against him. His flight suit looked almost gray under the overhead light, but his helmet visor reflected pure black, absorbing the beam the same way the jet did. He paused beside the nose gear, staring at the aircraft as if it were something alive. 1 hour in, 1 hour out, he murmured. Nobody sees us. This was the part that always felt unreal. Every other aircraft in history announced itself on radar. A blip, a return ping, a shape. The F-117 offered nothing. To enemy screens, it didn't appear damaged, or small, or faint, it appeared non-existent. And in a few minutes, Crowley would aim that impossible absence directly at Baghdad through one of the densest Soviet-built air defense grids on Earth. The final systems check came through. In the cockpit, the displays glowed faint green. Navigation, confirmed. Weapons bay, sealed. Radar cross-section profile, nominal. Crowley gripped the throttle, feeling the hum of the inert power system through his glove. Reeves stepped back into the dark, blending into the shadows as the jet's edges swallowed the light. At 2:49 a.m., the hangar doors began to open, spilling moonlight across the floor. The F-117 rolled forward, silent, sharp-edged, predatory, a machine no radar could see, moving toward a city that believed it was protected. Tonight, they would learn otherwise. By 3:06 a.m., the F-117 was already climbing through the moonlit haze above the Saudi desert, leaving the silent hangar far behind, as Major Crowley settled into the cockpit's narrow glow and adjusted to the strange stillness that always accompanied a stealth sortie. Ahead of him stretched nearly 600 miles of black sky, broken only by the thin white arc of the horizon and the faint glitter of distant thunderclouds blooming over Iraq like slow detonations waiting for their purpose. The navigation computer projected a tight corridor through the airspace, a narrow ribbon designed to exploit gaps in Soviet-built radar coverage that American analysts had spent years mapping with satellites and electronic surveillance aircraft, circling hundreds of miles away. Crowley knew that deviating even a mile would push him into a radar cone that might not detect him clearly, but might detect him just enough to turn invisible into vulnerable, especially once he crossed the border where the Iraqi defense grid began weaving its overlapping rows of early warning posts. Far below, the ground shifted from open desert to the jagged contours of rock and dry riverbeds, where convoys once moved under moonlight to hide from reconnaissance flights. Crowley felt the jet respond to each subtle command, its control surfaces whispering against the thin air like machinery designed for shadows rather than daylight, and he reminded himself that this aircraft was not meant to overpower the enemy, but to slip past them like a knife, pressed so close they never felt the blade. As he approached the Iraqi frontier, the mission timer blinked its quiet warning, and the electronic warfare suite displayed the first signals from the outer ring of Soviet-designed P-14 early warning radars stationed along the western approaches to Baghdad. Their beams swept wide arcs across the sky, powerful enough to detect bombers at extreme range, yet completely blind to the angular specter, passing through their reach like a moving hole in the electromagnetic spectrum. Crowley eased the throttle and allowed the aircraft to sink a few hundred feet, matching the pre-planned ingress altitude calculated to slip between coverage layers that overlapped imperfectly due to terrain distortions and outdated calibration reports. From this height, he could almost imagine the radar operators staring at empty screens, unaware that a jet built from geometry and mathematics was already weaving through their defenses without triggering a single tracking tone or warning light. The cockpit remained dark, except for the muted glow of the flight instruments, each number creeping forward with the slow inevitability of a countdown he could feel more than see. Baghdad still lay more than an hour ahead, but the true threat was not the city itself. It was the entire defensive web that protected it, a maze of radar sites, missile batteries, anti-aircraft guns, and command bunkers linked by cables and protocols older than the pilots who served inside them. Yet none of those systems mattered if they never received a signal to respond, and none were receiving anything now. Crowley breathed slow and steady, aware that he was flying through the quietest part of the mission, the narrow space where anticipation replaced fear, and the sky felt almost too calm, as if the night itself were holding its breath, while an invisible aircraft crossed into contested territory, unseen, untouched, and entirely alone. Inside Baghdad's Western Air Defense Command bunker, the atmosphere had shifted from routine vigilance to growing unease, as the night watch officers struggled to interpret a sky that looked strangely empty, despite intelligence reports warning of imminent American strikes. Banks of Soviet-built consoles filled the room with a dull electric hum, their green cathode ray displays sweeping long arcs across the grid, while dozens of operators leaned forward in the glow, waiting for the first sign of hostile aircraft approaching their sector. Lieutenant Colonel Samir Haddad, the senior officer on duty, walked slowly along the rows of radar stations, listening to the controllers speak in clipped, uncertain tones that betrayed how little they trusted the silence spreading across their screens. He had served through years of Iran-Iraq fighting and believed he understood the rhythm of air war, yet tonight's silence felt wrong in a way he could not fully articulate, as if something enormous were moving just beyond the edges of their perception. The P-18 early warning operator raised his voice first, reporting a brief pulse on the northern sweep that vanished before he could confirm it, prompting Haddad to lean over his console and demand precise coordinates that no one could provide because the trace had dissolved instantly into background noise. A moment later, a technician at the P-14 long-range radar insisted he was seeing amplitude fluctuations that did not match weather patterns, forcing the colonel to question whether the Americans were jamming them or whether the equipment was simply failing under the strain of continuous operation. As more screens began showing faint irregularities too weak to classify yet too distinct to ignore, the room's tension deepened, and officers exchanged uncertain glances, while trying to decide whether these anomalies were signs of incoming strikes or merely illusions created by overloaded electronics. Every man in the bunker knew that American aircraft rarely approached without warning, and the lack of solid returns felt like a threat in itself, pushing the colonel to pace between stations with his jaw clenched and his mind racing. He instructed the sector chief to widen the frequency sweep, believing that a broader search pattern might expose whatever was slipping between their established bands, but the expansion revealed only more silence punctuated by momentary flickers that vanished before the tracking software could establish a lock. The operators responded by increasing gain sensitivity in hopes of extracting a usable signal, yet the additional amplification only produced deeper static, punctuated by random spikes that failed to form anything resembling a coherent aerial track. The colonel ordered cross-checking with adjacent sectors, hoping to triangulate a target through layered detection, yet none of the neighboring posts could identify a single aircraft anywhere along the corridor where multiple American bombers had been expected to appear. This lack of confirmation left the bunker suspended in a state of anxious confusion, torn between activating alert protocols or waiting for firmer evidence of an approaching strike package that might already be overhead. A junior officer finally approached Haddad with a trembling voice, suggesting that their systems might be experiencing coordinated jamming, but the colonel rejected the explanation because no known jammer could erase aircraft signatures this completely without leaving unmistakable distortion patterns across multiple frequency bands. His refusal to accept the jamming theory only intensified the operator's anxiety, yet he knew admitting uncertainty would undermine the discipline holding his staff together during the most critical hours of the night. The bunker grew hotter as the consoles radiated warmth, and several operators wiped sweat from their brows while struggling to reconcile the mounting anomalies with the eerie emptiness dominating their screens, feeling as if the city were being watched by an enemy that refused to reveal itself. In that moment, Haddad realized he was not facing equipment, failure, or operator error, but something far more unsettling, a presence moving through their defenses with absolute confidence, leaving no trace except the fear it stirred in the men assigned to detect it. The procedures governing Baghdad's air defense network had been refined over decades of Soviet doctrine, and every operator inside the bunker knew their sequences by memory, repeating each step with near-ritual precision whenever the threat of American aircraft loomed over the city. According to the manual, the outer ring P-14 early warning radars were responsible for detecting incoming formations at long range, passing preliminary coordinates to mid-range P-18 units that filtered the raw signals into trackable data for missile batteries positioned along the capital's defensive perimeter. Once a contact reached the threshold where multiple radars could confirm its presence, the system should have assigned a numerical track identifier, while designated command posts calculated headings, speeds, and altitude changes to determine whether the target was a bomber, a fighter, or a decoy attempting to draw fire. The operators were trained to expect clear returns shaped like bright wedges or sharp spikes, each representing a reflective aircraft structure, bouncing energy back into their receivers with characteristic signatures that experienced controllers could interpret almost instinctively. The guideline required forming a stable track for at least 3 consecutive sweeps before passing firing authority to the missile control officers, who then aligned their SA-2, SA-3, or SA-6 batteries with the predicted flight path while awaiting confirmation of hostile intent. These steps formed a rigid hierarchy that discouraged improvisation, reinforcing the belief that a well-designed radar net, if properly maintained, could intercept any conventional aircraft the Americans deployed against them during the opening hours of a major strike. Because the manual emphasized coordination over intuition, operators were expected to trust their screens more than their instincts, relying on the layered detection model that bound each station to the others through cables, protocols, and meticulously timed data-sharing procedures. The system worked efficiently during training exercises, where simulated aircraft produced predictable returns that allowed controllers to demonstrate clean handoffs between sectors, confirming that the architecture could respond to multiple incursions simultaneously. In practice, the network depended heavily on aircraft being visible enough for its algorithms to process, since each radar pulse assumed the target would reflect energy in ways consistent with known profiles taught in Soviet military academies. The procedures reinforced the belief that an aircraft could be fast, maneuverable, or low-flying, but never truly invisible, causing the bunker personnel to interpret anomalies as equipment faults rather than evidence of platforms designed specifically to evade detection altogether. Missile crews stationed outside the city repeated their own checklists as they monitored the bunker's encrypted feed, preparing guidance antennas, powering coolant systems, and aligning launch rails based on projected trajectories they believed would arrive once the radars stabilized. Each team waited for the unmistakable tracking tone that signaled a target had entered the engagement envelope, a sound drilled into their memories during years of training and emphasized repeatedly as the moment when control shifted from detection to destruction. The doctrine insisted that failure to identify an aircraft before it reached firing range was almost impossible unless operators committed serious procedural errors, which was why Haddad's staff struggled to reconcile the silence dominating their instruments with the increasingly urgent reports from observers positioned near Baghdad's western outskirts. Every man in the bunker knew that the system should have recognized American jets long before they approached weapons release range, and the absence of those returns gnawed at their confidence with each passing minute. As the radar sweeps continued, showing nothing but fleeting distortions, the operators clung to the structure of their manual like a lifeline, reviewing protocols they had never expected to question and reassuring themselves that adherence to the established sequence would eventually expose the intruders. Yet the longer they followed the steps without receiving usable data, the more the room felt suspended between discipline and disbelief, trapped in a doctrine built for a world where aircraft always left footprints and never slipped through the sky like shadows. The deeper flaw undermining Baghdad's entire air defense network had nothing to do with operator discipline or outdated manuals, but with a physics problem none of the Soviet engineers who designed the radars had fully anticipated when they conceived systems meant to detect conventional aircraft with predictable reflective surfaces. Those older designs assumed that any airborne object larger than a small drone would return a measurable pulse, creating a clear echo that could be filtered, amplified, and transformed into a stable track long before the target reached a critical engagement zone. However, the F-117 defied those assumptions because its faceted geometry scattered radar energy away from the source rather than back toward the receivers, producing reflections so weak that they blended almost perfectly into atmospheric noise, leaving the Iraqi operators searching for patterns that simply were never meant to exist. Even when the beams from the P-14's massive antenna swept directly across the jet's flight corridor, the energy returned to the console was so faint that the software mistook it for horizon clutter or minor electrical fluctuations caused by uneven voltage supplies. Compounding the issue, the radars, especially the P-18 units relying on VHF bands, suffered from calibration drift due to heat, sand intrusion, and months of continuous operation, making them even less capable of detecting a target engineered to exploit every weakness in the electromagnetic spectrum. The technicians performed routine recalibrations throughout the night, adjusting gain thresholds and realigning receiver modules, yet none of their corrections could overcome a fundamental design limitation that rendered their systems blind to an aircraft whose surfaces reflected almost nothing. The Soviet manuals never addressed such a scenario because the concept of a fully stealth strike aircraft seemed implausible during the era when those radars were standardized, leading the designers to focus on combating maneuverable fighters and high-altitude bombers rather than platforms intentionally crafted to manipulate the physics of detection. As a result, the Iraqi crews interpreted the F-117's absence not as evidence of an invisible intruder, but as signs of failing equipment, a conclusion reinforced by their prior experience dealing with interference from weather fronts, power fluctuations, and occasional jamming attempts from American reconnaissance flights. Each operator who noticed a brief flicker assumed another station would confirm it, while those at neighboring consoles dismissed the anomalies as stray noise that would resolve itself once system stability returned, creating a feedback loop where uncertainty compounded itself until no one trusted the data enough to elevate the situation. Even the bunker's senior officers hesitated to attribute the silence to hostile aircraft, because acknowledging that possibility required admitting their entire defensive network could be bypassed without warning, undermining years of confidence built on Soviet assurances of near impenetrable coverage. As the minutes dragged on, the hidden flaw continued shaping every decision inside the bunker, forcing the officers to rely on doctrine that presumed targets behaved predictably, reflected consistently, and generated returns strong enough to trigger automated targeting sequences. Yet none of those assumptions applied to the jet cutting through their airspace with cold precision, and every moment they spent validating their equipment allowed the F-117 to close the distance toward its target, unseen and unchallenged. In that sense, the problem wasn't a single malfunction or human error, but a systemic vulnerability created by technology that had never been designed to confront an aircraft built on mathematics rather than brute force. The Iraqi crews were attempting to solve a puzzle missing half its pieces, searching for echoes that physics had erased, and clinging to doctrines that offered no guidance for a threat defined by near-total absence rather than measurable presence. As the unexplained silence stretched deeper into the night, Colonel Haddad finally ordered his operators to abandon passive observation and initiate the first tier of improvised countermeasures, hoping that increased system aggression might expose whatever anomaly was slipping between their radar beams. The technicians responded instantly by widening detection cones, boosting transmission power, and cycling through alternate frequency bands, each adjustment executed with the growing desperation of men who sensed something moving in the darkness but could not compel their instruments to reveal it. The P-18 crews, frustrated by the lack of stable returns, manually recalibrated their receivers while attempting to amplify faint distortions that might indicate a low reflective aircraft attempting to cross the sector unnoticed. But the increased gain produced only thicker static, layered with random pulses that confused their tracking algorithms even further. Haddad moved from station to station, urging his men to remain focused, though he could feel their confidence eroding each time another recalibrated sweep returned. Nothing more than the same jittering horizon line they had been staring at since the mission began. Several officers proposed switching to low-frequency sweeps in hopes of detecting larger shapes through resonance effects, yet the equipment struggled to process the additional noise created by atmospheric moisture and urban interference, forcing the crew to choose between useful clarity and raw sensitivity. Each compromise introduced new problems, and as the consoles flickered with unstable data, the staff became increasingly aware that no combination of settings seemed capable of revealing a coherent trace, even though intelligence reports insisted American aircraft were already inbound. In a final attempt to force a breakthrough, Haddad authorized a partial override of the defensive protocols, allowing the sector chief to synchronize multiple radars into a shared sweep pattern normally reserved for high-confidence threats. The synchronized pulses flooded the sky with overlapping waves that should have illuminated any airborne object, regardless of altitude, angle, or speed. Yet the results remained unchanged. No stable echoes, no confirmable contacts, only brief spikes that died before operators could lock onto them. Frustration pushed some crews to consider whether they should trigger the engagement sequence preemptively, launching missiles toward projected corridors based on outdated intelligence rather than reliable radar data. But Haddad dismissed the idea immediately because firing blind risked revealing their positions without guaranteeing a single hit. The missile batteries outside Baghdad waited tensely for proper authorization, their crews sweating beneath the heavy night air, while monitors displayed empty grids that contradicted their instincts and training. Inside the bunker, the atmosphere grew increasingly claustrophobic as the operators realized their tools were fundamentally inadequate for a threat that refused to behave like any aircraft they had confronted before. Attempts to cross-reference thermal observatories failed due to rising ground temperatures that produced false positives, while acoustic sensors proved useless against a jet designed to minimize noise and fly with a smoothness that defied conventional detection. Each new improvisation seemed to deepen the sense of helplessness spreading through the bunker, because every adjustment confirmed that the enemy was neither jamming nor evading, but simply bypassing their entire defensive architecture through technological superiority. The officers exchanged anxious whispers while recalculating worst-case scenarios, struggling to comprehend how an aircraft could draw so close without leaving a definable trace, as if the sky itself had chosen to conceal it from their instruments. By the time the operators realized their improvisations were futile, the F-117 was already skimming silently along its assigned corridor, drifting ever closer to Baghdad with the same calm inevitability it had carried since takeoff. The bunker's desperate attempts to claw a shadow out of the darkness had achieved nothing, and the invisible intruder continued its approach completely unaffected by the frantic human efforts unfolding miles below, guided only by mathematics, precision, and a design philosophy years ahead of the technology struggling to find it. While the air defense bunker wrestled with its failing detection efforts, outlying stations began reporting their own fragmented observations, creating a chaotic mosaic of contradictory signals that only deepened the mystery surrounding whatever was moving through the night sky. One northern observation post claimed to have seen a faint flash above the horizon, but the visual team insisted it was merely heat lightning, rolling off distant thunderclouds, rather than the exhaust plume of an approaching strike aircraft. A western site suggested that a momentary glint had appeared on their optical tracker, yet the operator admitted he was adjusting focus at the time, leaving his supervisors unsure whether the flicker represented a genuine sighting or simply a reflection bouncing off the lens. Additional posts contributed similarly uncertain fragments, each offering minor clues that hinted at a presence they could not confirm, reinforcing the sense that something large and silent was weaving between their defenses with frightening ease. Seeking clarity, Colonel Haddad ordered a second tier of diagnostic checks across the network, instructing each station to document every anomaly, regardless of how trivial it appeared, in the hopes that a pattern might emerge from the accumulated noise. The operators dutifully logged each pulse, distortion, and glitch, but the compiled data resembled a storm of random static more than an organized threat profile, leaving the analysts struggling to identify anything resembling a consistent trajectory. To break the impasse, Haddad authorized a limited triangulation effort using 3 independent stations, believing that even a marginal return captured from different angles might reveal the intruder's approximate altitude and heading. The teams synchronized their sweeps with practiced coordination, yet each radar recorded only faint blips that appeared in one cycle and vanished before the next, dissolving into formless haze that contributed nothing to the triangulation algorithm. As the frustration mounted, several operators argued that the anomalies must represent electronic deception, insisting the Americans were using sophisticated jamming to hide a larger strike package advancing behind a wall of interference. However, this theory collapsed as quickly as it formed because the anomalies lacked the structured patterns typical of jamming signatures, which usually produced recognizable distortions rather than this inconsistent drizzle of almost imperceptible pulses. Still searching for answers, the sector leads initiated a manual cross-referencing routine that required operators to compare isolated anomalies across multiple frequencies, hoping that subtle correlations might reveal a narrowband echo slipping through their detection gaps. The process generated dozens of overlapping charts, annotated with circles, arrows, and speculative headings, Yet every attempt to connect the fragments led to dead ends that forced the analysts to restart their search from scratch. Meanwhile, outside Baghdad, missile crews anxiously scanned the skies with night vision scopes and binoculars, relying on human eyes rather than radar to identify potential threats, only to find the same empty darkness that had tormented their electronic counterparts. The absence of visible aircraft left the crews questioning whether the Americans had postponed their strike or whether the reports circulating through command channels were exaggerated, though an uneasiness in their voices betrayed their doubts. Back inside the bunker, Haddad reviewed the night's accumulating logs with a tightening chest, realizing that the anomalies did not represent equipment, malfunctions, or deceptive tactics, but rather the shadows of a craft engineered to minimize every measurable signature. The operators who initially dismissed the distortions as meaningless static now whispered to one another, wondering how an aircraft could erase its presence so completely that even their most aggressive detection methods failed to produce a coherent return. Despite hours of coordinated searching, recalibration, and analysis, the network remained blind, and the F-117 continued its silent approach along a corridor that had effectively become a tunnel carved through the center of Iraq's defenses. Every failed attempt reinforced a grim truth. Their systems were functioning exactly as designed, yet none of them were designed for a threat built on the deliberate exploitation of those limitations, leaving Baghdad exposed to an enemy they could neither see nor understand. The truth behind the radar silence lay not in Iraqi mistakes or Soviet negligence, but in a radical design philosophy that redefined how an aircraft could exist within the electromagnetic spectrum by manipulating every aspect of its geometry, materials, and flight behavior to create something closer to an absence than a conventional military platform. The F-117 surface, unlike the rounded fuselages of traditional jets, was composed of angular facets arranged with mathematical precision, ensuring that nearly all incoming radar waves were deflected away from the transmitting antenna rather than reflected back toward the receiver. These facets were calculated using equations derived from early theoretical work on electromagnetic scattering, meaning the aircraft did not need to be aerodynamically perfect to succeed. It only needed to redirect energy into directions that rendered it effectively invisible to the systems hunting for it. Even when a radar pulse struck a facet at an unfavorable angle, the pulse would scatter into multiple directions with such weak intensity that the returning signal resembled background atmospheric noise rather than a discrete, trackable object. Complementing this geometric stealth was a skin coated with radar-absorbent material designed to convert incoming energy into trace amounts of heat, further reducing the aircraft's radar cross-section until it measured smaller than a large bird at distances where most radars expected to detect bomber-sized threats. The combination of angular deflection and energy absorption produced an aircraft that left almost no measurable signature, undermining the core assumption upon which the entire Soviet radar doctrine rested, that every object larger than a drone must produce a meaningful return. The designers strengthened this advantage by shaping the intakes, exhaust nozzles, and internal components to hide the jet's engine fans and reduce thermal emissions, preventing heat-seeking sensors from identifying bright hotspots that normally guided infrared tracking systems toward high-performance aircraft. Even the engine exhaust was channeled through flattened outlets that dispersed heat across wider surfaces, ensuring that the plume blended with ambient air before any ground-based sensors could isolate it against the cooler night sky. Navigation systems added another layer of invisibility by guiding the jet along narrow flight corridors calculated to exploit natural gaps in radar coverage, while maintaining altitudes that minimized exposure to secondary detection sources, such as civilian weather radars or ground-based scatter returns. These routes were refined through satellite surveillance and electronic intelligence gathered over years, ensuring that the F-117 entered enemy airspace at the precise angles least likely to produce radar reflections strong enough to draw attention. Even the aircraft's flight controls contributed to its stealth profile by maintaining smooth, deliberate motions rather than abrupt maneuvers that might expose its surfaces to unfavorable radar angles, allowing the jet to move through contested airspace with the drifting grace of something deliberately avoiding detection. This emphasis on controlled motion meant that the F-117 behaved more like a precision instrument than a traditional strike aircraft, sacrificing raw agility for the silent confidence that came from minimizing every detectable signature. Inside the cockpit, Major Crowley relied on inertial navigation and encrypted communications that operated within tightly controlled windows, reducing the risk of electronic emissions betraying his presence to any listening posts or signal triangulation teams stationed below. His instruments displayed the calculated stealth profile in real time, ensuring that every minor course correction preserved the delicate balance that kept the aircraft hidden from radars designed to detect energy, not the lack of it. By the time the jet crossed deeper into Iraqi territory, the science behind its invisibility had become more than theory or engineering. It had become a shield woven from mathematics and intention, rendering the F-117 untouchable by systems built upon assumptions decades older than the technology now slipping between their beams. Each mile it covered without detection illustrated the widening gap between those who embraced the emerging logic of stealth and those who clung to doctrines unable to imagine an aircraft crafted to manipulate the very physics that once defined the limits of air warfare. As the F-117 drifted deeper toward the city, the consequences of Iraq's systemic vulnerabilities became increasingly evident because every minute of silence inside the air defense bunker allowed Major Crowley to cross another layer of the supposedly impenetrable Soviet-built network without triggering even a single alert. The entire system had been designed to overwhelm intruders with overlapping detection rings, yet those layers now functioned like a series of blindfolds rather than protective shields, each passing the responsibility to the next in a futile effort to locate something that refused to leave a measurable trace. On the western perimeter, missile crews waiting beside their SA-2 launchers scanned the sky with mounting anxiety, their equipment humming with readiness, even though the targeting indicators remained stubbornly dark despite repeated recalibration attempts. These crews had trained for years to react within seconds once a radar lock appeared, but the absence of any confirmed tracks left them suspended in a state of intense anticipation, unsure whether they were moments away from combat or merely witnessing another false alarm. Further north, the operators at a P-18 station tried overlaying their most recent anomalies onto old flight path predictions, hoping to reconstruct a trajectory from the scattered data points, yet the resulting map resembled a chaotic swirl with no coherent direction. This failure only deepened the operators' frustration, because their models assumed enemy aircraft behaved predictably, not like specters gliding through the detection grid with a precision that seemed almost deliberate. Inside the bunker, Colonel Haddad watched the cumulative failures unfold across the command table's projection display, which remained stubbornly blank even as reports from ground observers indicated the distant thump of explosions near the Iranian border. He knew those detonations could not be weather phenomena and likely represented the early phases of American strikes on outlying facilities, yet the inability to link those impacts to any visible aircraft left him unsure how to respond without compromising the remaining defenses. Meanwhile, Crowley began descending along his pre-planned attack corridor, adjusting his throttle to maintain the precise velocity required for the weapons computer to calculate optimal release conditions once he reached the target zone. The city's dim glow began rising ahead, spreading across the horizon like a low, shimmering haze, and he could see isolated searchlights probing the sky with nervous, sweeping beams that seemed more symbolic than strategic. These searchlights, despite their theatrical intensity, could not reveal an aircraft engineered to absorb light rather than reflect it, and their broad, frantic arcs only emphasized the growing desperation within the defenders who had no reliable data to guide their aim. From his altitude, Crowley noticed the occasional bright muzzle flash from anti-aircraft guns firing blindly into the darkness, their operators hoping to saturate the sky with enough metal to hit something they could not see. Each burst of gunfire underscored the widening collapse of Iraq's defensive posture, because weapons designed to rely on radar guidance were now being fired using guesswork rather than calculated intercepts. This shift marked the moment when a technologically inferior side recognized its systems had failed, yet continued resisting through brute force, trying to compensate with noise and chaos for the blindness that their radars could not overcome. Crowley maintained his composure, monitoring the aircraft's internal diagnostics, while confirming the final approach markers that indicated he was seconds from entering the designated release zone. The F-117 responded with the same silent precision it had displayed since takeoff, gliding through the chaotic airspace like an object completely unaffected by the storm of human confusion unfolding beneath it. As the jet reached its attack altitude, the city's defensive lines remained unaware of his exact location, relying on scattered reports and aimless speculation rather than actionable intelligence. Their systems were still cycling through mismatched data, attempting to reconcile anomalies that had been haunting them for over an hour, and none of their algorithms could produce a single coherent track because the aircraft generating those anomalies was engineered to erase itself at the moment detection should have been possible. By the time Baghdad realized something had penetrated their defenses, the F-117 was already aligning its internal targeting computer with the glowing silhouette of the objective ahead, a silent shadow preparing to deliver the strike that would expose the full extent of their vulnerability. The first confirmation that something had finally slipped past Iraq's defenses arrived not from the radar stations or command bunkers, but from a series of sharp, rolling detonations that echoed across western Baghdad with a precision no weather event or artillery volley could possibly replicate. These explosions struck with a deliberate rhythm, each impact spaced exactly according to the interval predicted in American strike planning, leaving the defenders with no doubt that a hostile aircraft had reached the city despite their desperate attempts to locate it. Reports from ground observers began streaming into the bunker in fragmented bursts, describing flashes rising behind industrial complexes and government buildings that should have been shielded by multiple layers of anti-aircraft coverage, yet none of the outposts responsible for those areas had registered a single radar track before the strikes occurred. Every account relayed the same unsettling detail. The sky remained empty, with no visible shape, no audible engine roar, and no trace of the aircraft responsible for the destruction blooming across the city. Colonel Haddad listened to the incoming reports with a tightening jaw, recognizing the unmistakable signature of precision-guided munitions, whose accuracy exceeded anything his Soviet instructors had prepared him to counter. The lack of visible aircraft only intensified the sense of helplessness spreading through his command team, because the explosions provided irrefutable proof that an intruder had entered Baghdad's airspace, while their instruments insisted nothing had crossed the detection grid. He ordered multiple radars to rescan the impacted sectors, hoping that post-strike turbulence might reveal traces of the aircraft fleeing the area, yet the screens remained agonizingly blank, except for residual clutter generated by the heat and debris rising into the atmosphere. Even optical trackers deployed near key installations found nothing, because the F-117 had already turned away from Baghdad and begun its exit run, climbing into the darkness with the same silent confidence it had displayed during its approach. In the minutes that followed, technicians scrambled to synchronize timestamps from various observation posts, attempting to reconstruct a timeline that might illuminate how the aircraft bypassed the network. However, the collected data revealed only a frustrating absence. Each radar sweep recorded nothing at the precise moments when the detonations occurred, creating a gap in the historical record that underscored the system's failure more clearly than any written analysis could. Military intelligence analysts, reviewing the logs, noted that even facilities positioned directly beneath the jet's flight path had detected no measurable interference, suggesting the aircraft had neither jammed the radars nor attempted to mask itself through deceptive emissions. Instead, the silence indicated a platform whose design reduced its visibility so drastically that the radars simply failed to perceive it as a meaningful object within their operational parameters, confirming theories long dismissed as speculative exaggeration. Meanwhile, American surveillance aircraft orbiting far from the engagement zone observed the strike in real time through infrared and synthetic aperture systems, recording crisp thermal signatures of the explosions and transmitting them to commanders who monitored the success of the mission without detecting any Iraqi defensive response. The absence of counterfire validated the stealth doctrine's premise. A weapon that cannot be seen cannot be engaged, and a target that cannot be engaged cannot be stopped. These assessments provided the first concrete evidence that stealth technology had fundamentally shifted the balance between offense and defense, marking a decisive moment in the evolution of modern air warfare. By dawn, word of the invisible strike had begun circulating among foreign military observers stationed across the region, many of whom recognized its implications immediately. The established principles of radar detection had been challenged by a platform designed to exploit weaknesses previously considered theoretical. Baghdad's inability to counter the jet served as undeniable proof that a new era had begun, one in which the world's most robust air defense systems could be rendered irrelevant by aircraft engineered to disappear within the very frequencies meant to expose them. By the time the sun began rising over the western edge of Baghdad, the implications of the night's invisible strike were already rippling far beyond the city, because the absence of any radar track had delivered a message more devastating than the explosions themselves. Across every command post, still reviewing the blank screens from the previous hours, officers confronted a reality they had never been trained to accept. An aircraft could move through their defenses, without ever joining the electromagnetic world they depended upon to perceive threats. International observers quickly realized the significance of what had transpired, recognizing that traditional assumptions about air power had been overturned by a design philosophy that prioritized invisibility over speed, altitude, or payload. Nations that had relied on layered Soviet-style air defense networks found themselves questioning whether their most sophisticated radars, missile systems, and integrated command architectures could withstand a similar encounter against a technology engineered to exploit every predictable element of their doctrine. In Moscow, analysts studying intercepted communications and post-strike assessments concluded that the engagement represented more than a tactical setback for Iraq. It demonstrated a systemic vulnerability within radar-based detection models that had guided global military planning for decades. Their reports warned that stealth aircraft, if mass-produced and refined over time, could neutralize even the most advanced surface-to-air missile networks by reducing engagement opportunities to near zero before defenders realized they were under attack. Western air forces, meanwhile, viewed the success of the F-117 as proof that future conflicts would favor platforms capable of avoiding confrontation altogether, rather than overpowering enemy defenses through sheer volume of fire. This realization accelerated investment in low observable technology, pushing research teams to pursue sharper geometries, superior absorption materials, and more sophisticated electronic management systems that could keep aircraft hidden not only from radar, but also from infrared and passive detection sensors. The U.S. Air Force, analyzing the mission's data, recognized that stealth was not merely a technological advantage, but a strategic tool capable of dismantling an enemy's decision-making cycle by depriving commanders of the information required to coordinate meaningful resistance. In countless briefings following the strike, officers emphasized that the absence of detection had caused the defenders to misinterpret key signals, delay responses, and squander resources on blind countermeasures that contributed nothing to their actual defense. For Iraq, the legacy of that night became a somber reminder of how quickly decades of preparation could unravel when confronted by a threat designed outside the boundaries of their expectations. Their engineers spent months reviewing logs, calibrations, and equipment performance, searching for a flaw they could correct. Yet the more deeply they studied the data, the clearer it became that no amount of maintenance could compensate for the fundamental mismatch between their systems and the stealth platform that had bypassed them. Even among civilian analysts observing the conflict from afar, the strike reshaped discussions about vulnerability and technological asymmetry, fueling debates about how modern nations could defend themselves in an era when aircraft might not appear on screens until after the damage had already been done. Universities, research institutes, and defense think tanks began publishing analyses that framed stealth not as an incremental improvement, but as a paradigm shift capable of rendering large portions of Cold War military theory obsolete. Decades later, pilots and engineers would look back on that first night over Baghdad as the moment when modern air warfare evolved into something fundamentally different, defined not by visible dominance but by the ability to control perception itself. The F-117's success demonstrated that the future belonged to those who understood that survival depended not on being stronger or faster, but on embracing the logic of invisibility, turning the sky into a domain where detection could no longer be trusted, and certainty could vanish in the silence of a single passing shadow. When the last echoes of the night's explosions faded, and Baghdad settled beneath a pale, dust-filled sunrise, the invisible strike left behind more than shattered structures and scorched pavement. It left a question that lingered in every bunker, every flight line, and every command tent across the region. The defenders who spent hours searching for an enemy they never saw now understood that the battle had not been lost through weakness or hesitation, but through the harsh realization that a war can be decided by something as simple and as terrifying as absence. For the Iraqi operators who had watched their screens glow with meaningless static, the night served as a reminder that certainty can collapse in an instant when the tools meant to interpret the world fail to describe what is actually happening. They had followed procedures with textbook precision, trusting established doctrine built on decades of predictable patterns, yet none of those patterns applied to an adversary that refused to behave like anything they had been trained to confront. In the American hangars hundreds of miles away, technicians who had prepared the F-117 under dim lights reflected on the strange duality of their work, knowing that their meticulous attention to detail had allowed a single aircraft to reshape the balance of an entire theater without anyone on the ground ever identifying its presence. To them, the mission